Tamara Uba understood the terms of her marriage to Insuk Kwan before she ever signed her name to them. 2 years of sharing a penthouse without sharing a life. 2 years of moving through the same marble-floored halls like shadows that refused to touch. 2 years of sitting across from him at a dinner table so long it might as well have been a different country, his jaw set, his eyes elsewhere, his silence, a wall she had long since stopped trying to climb. So she stopped trying. She stopped waiting for him to notice the way she dressed for dinners he never attended. Stopped pausing outside his study door, wondering if this was the night he'd finally look at her like she was something more than a strategic acquisition. Stopped sleeping on the left side of the bed out of some quiet, embarrassing hope that one day the right side wouldn't stay cold. Tamara Uba, elegant, composed, her dark hair pulled into a low, polished bun, had learned to wear her heartbreak the way she wore everything else. Quietly, perfectly, without a single visible seam. And Insuk Kwan, sharp-jawed, immaculate in his tailored black suit, a man whose name alone made entire syndicates lower their voices, had spent 2 years telling himself that was exactly what he wanted. Distance was discipline, discipline was survival, and wanting her, really wanting her, was the one thing in his world he could not afford. He had convinced himself he had it handled. Until the night he walked past her door at 1:47 inches the morning and heard it. Not screaming, not drama, just a sound so small it almost wasn't there. A breath, broken at the edges, swallowed before it could become anything louder. Insuk stopped walking. His hand, the same hand that had signed death warrants without flinching, that had negotiated in rooms where the wrong word meant a body in the harbor, pressed flat against her door. And for the first time in 15 years of ruling through fear and ice and perfect control, he didn't know what to do with his own chest. She wasn't crying for attention. There was no performance in it. The woman on the other side of that door had her arms wrapped around herself. He somehow knew this without seeing it, holding herself together in the dark, alone. In a marriage where the man she was bound to had made his indifference so absolute she'd stopped expecting even a fragment of warmth. She wasn't crying because of him. That was what shattered something behind his ribs. She was crying because she had accepted it. Accepted him, this version of him, as permanent, as the whole story, as all she would ever get. And Insuk Kwan, who had never in his life been afraid of anything, felt the specific, suffocating terror of a man who has just realized he has been slowly, methodically destroying the only thing that ever mattered, not through cruelty, but through absence. 2 years of silence, one sound that changed everything. But the real question isn't what he does next, it's whether she'll still be willing to listen. If you need to know what happens when the most dangerous man in Korea has to face the one person his power can't fix, follow for Chapter 1, because this story is just getting started. 2 years. That was how long Insuk had managed it. 2 years of perfect, practiced indifference, and then one sound, barely louder than a breath, had reduced all of it to rubble. He didn't sleep that night. He stood outside her door for 4 minutes and 37 seconds, he knew, because he counted. Because counting was the only thing that kept his hand from turning the handle, and then he walked to his study, poured 2 fingers of whiskey he didn't drink, and sat in the dark until morning arrived, gray and indifferent through the floor-to-ceiling windows. By the time Tamara appeared in the kitchen at 7, hair pinned back, dark-fitted dress already pressed to perfection, there was nothing on her face, not a trace. She moved through the morning like a woman who had already buried whatever broke in her the night before, had folded it neatly, tucked it somewhere he wasn't meant to find, and sealed the whole thing shut. She didn't look at him. He didn't speak. She poured her coffee, gathered her things, and left. Insuk watched the empty space where she'd stood for a long moment after the elevator doors closed. Then he picked up his phone and did something he had never once done in 2 years of marriage. He pulled up the security feed for the East Wing. He told himself it was a security concern. Tamara had been emotionally compromised. His words clinical, contained, and in his world, emotional compromise created vulnerabilities. He needed to assess her state, monitor the situation. It was the rational response of a man responsible for an empire that couldn't afford weak points. He almost believed it. What he actually did was watch her move through the penthouse for 3 days straight. He learned things he had no language for, things he'd been close enough to notice for 2 years and had deliberately refused to see. The way she sat by the north window every evening with a book she never seemed to actually read, her gaze drifting to the city lights below like she was searching for something she couldn't name. The way she always made 2 cups of tea at night, and then stood at the counter looking at the second one, before quietly pouring it down the drain. 2 cups. Every night. He sat with that for a long time. He noticed the small rituals she'd built to fill a life that had been handed to her half empty. Fresh flowers she arranged herself every Sunday, pale and structural, nothing soft, nothing that needed too much tending. The low music she played when she thought no one was listening. The way she stood in front of the large mirror in the hallway sometimes, not admiring herself, but studying herself like she was checking to make sure she was still there. He had given her a gilded cage and called it protection. And she had spent 2 years making it livable. Something moved through his chest that he didn't have a name for. He filed it under observation noted and kept watching. He started appearing. Not obviously, In-suk Kwon did not do anything obviously, but where he had previously arranged his schedule to guarantee their paths didn't cross, he now arranged it so that they did, briefly, casually, in ways that could be explained. He was in the kitchen when she came down for coffee. He was finishing a call near the north window when she came to sit with her unread book. He passed her in the hallway and said nothing, but he slowed, just slightly, just enough that the silence between them lasted 2 full seconds longer than it used to. She noticed. He could tell by the way her shoulders shifted a micro-adjustment, almost imperceptible. The kind of tension a person develops when they realize they're being watched by something they don't yet know is predator or protection. She said nothing either. But she stopped pouring the second cup of tea down the drain quite so quickly. He was in his study on the 4th night when he heard her laugh. Not at him, he wouldn't have known what to do with that. It came through the slightly open door of the sitting room, bright and startled, like she'd caught herself off guard. He heard her voice, soft, talking to someone on the phone. A friend, maybe, her sister, someone who lived in the part of her life that existed before all of this. In-suk set down his pen. He had never heard her laugh like that inside these walls. He sat very still and listened to the sound of his wife being herself freely, unself-consciously, in a room 20 feet away, and felt the particular, ugly weight of understanding exactly how much of that he had never made space for. He had married her for reasons that had made sense at the time. Her family's reach in East African trade networks, the legitimacy her name lent to his operations, the strategic elegance of the union. He had stood beside her at the altar and recited words he treated as contract terms and told himself that was all it needed to be. He had been so certain that wanting more was the dangerous part. Now, listening to her laugh fade as the call ended and the silence returned, he understood he'd had it backwards the entire time. The danger wasn't wanting her. The danger was this, what he was feeling now, the specific devastation of realizing what you've wasted while you were busy being careful. On the 6th day, she pulled away. He noticed it the moment he walked into the kitchen, and she didn't glance up. Not the deliberate, practiced, not looking of the past 2 years, something different. Something that had texture to it. A decision. Her posture had changed. She held herself more inward, shoulders angled slightly away, arms crossing her own body the way they had in the security feed on the night she cried. The self-containment had returned, but harder now, more intentional. She was recalibrating. He recognized it because he had done it himself, dozens of times, in negotiations where the other side had briefly shown him something real and then pulled it back. You retreat. You reassess. You stop expecting. Tamara Uba was done expecting. He watched her rinse her cup, dry her hands with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had decided that nothing happening in this kitchen required her full attention, and leave without a word. In-suk stood at the counter for a long moment. His reflection in the darkened window looked back at him composed, immaculate, jaw set, every line of him projecting exactly the control he had spent a lifetime building. He looked, he realized, exactly like a man who deserved to be left. He started to intervene. Not dramatically, he still didn't know how to do anything dramatically, didn't have the vocabulary for it, had spent too many years in rooms where the first person to show feeling lost the room. But the studied absence he had maintained for 2 years began to have edges now, places where it cracked and something else pushed through without his permission. He had her favorite tea ordered before she woke on the 7th morning, a specific Kenyan blend she bought herself every month, the one that sat in the cabinet and that he had never once acknowledged knowing about. He left it on the counter beside the kettle without explanation. When she came downstairs and saw it, she went very still. She looked at it for a long time. Then she made her coffee instead and left the tea exactly where it was. He almost respected her for it. Almost. On the ninth night, he heard her again. Not crying different this time, quieter than that somehow. He was passing her door when he heard the sound of something setting down hard, and then nothing, and then the particular quality of silence that has weight to it, that presses against walls. He stopped. 15 years of reading rooms told him this was a different kind of breaking. Not grief, not longing. Resolution. He raised his hand to knock. Stopped. Stood there with his knuckles an inch from the door and something unfamiliar flooding his chest. Something that felt, if he were honest, which he almost never was, like fear. Not the operational kind, not the cold-eyed calculation of threat assessment, something older. The fear of a man standing at a door he doesn't know how to open because he spent so long convincing himself it needed to stay closed. He lowered his hand, walked back to his study, sat down, and for the second time in 9 days, In-suk Kwan, who had ordered silence with a look, who had commanded rooms of dangerous men with nothing more than stillness, did not know what to do with himself. He picked up his phone and stared at her name in his contacts for a long time. He had never once called her just to call her. He put the phone down. Then he picked it up again and typed 3 words into a message thread that had been empty for 2 years of marriage. "Are you all right?" He stared at it, deleted it, typed it again, left it sitting there, unsent, while the city spread itself out 20 floors below him, indifferent and glittering, and somewhere in the East Wing his wife made whatever decision she was making in the dark. He pressed send at 2:14 inches the morning. The message showed as read 11 seconds later. She didn't reply. And somehow, that silence chosen, deliberate, entirely hers, hit him harder than anything that had come before it. He saw it in her eyes the next morning. She came down later than usual, already dressed to leave, bag over her shoulder, the kind of composure that isn't calm, but is impersonating it. She pulled up short when she found him at the kitchen counter, not seated, not performing ease, just standing there like a man who had decided to stop manufacturing reasons to be somewhere. For the first time in 10 days, they looked directly at each other. There it was, in her gaze, the thing he had been tracking in the security feeds, in the slight angles of her body, in the silence she sent back to his 2 a.m. message. It wasn't anger. Anger would have been easier. Anger meant she still expected something from him. This was worse. This was the look of a woman who had finally, completely, stopped. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, he counted, and something passed across her face that he thought, if he'd had more practice reading her, might have been the ghost of whatever she used to feel before she learned better. Then she looked away, smoothed the strap of her bag, and said, in a voice so composed it could have passed for pleasant, "I'll be out until this evening," and walked to the elevator. He stood in the kitchen and listened to the doors close behind her and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives too late in most men's lives, that he had maybe run out of mornings like this one. That the woman in the elevator was not waiting for him anymore. And that the choice in front of him, the one he'd been circling for 10 days with the careful non-commitment of a man who had never once let anything matter too much, had just developed an expiration date. Like what you've read so far? Follow for Chapter 6, because the moment In-suk finally stops circling and steps through that door is the moment everything changes. He stepped through that door on a Tuesday. Not metaphorically, literally. He walked to the East Wing at 11 in the evening, raised his hand, and knocked. 3 times. Measured, like everything he did. Except his pulse, which was doing something he hadn't felt since he was 23, and new to a world that required him to be made of stone. Tamara opened the door in a dark silk robe, hair down. He had never seen her hair down, not once in 2 years, and the sight of it hit him somewhere unarmored. Her eyes moved over him once, twice, reading him the way she had learned to read everything in this marriage, carefully, without expectation, already bracing for disappointment. In-suk, not a greeting, just his name, placed between them like a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. "You didn't reply," he said. She blinked. To a message sent at 2 in the morning 2 weeks after 2 years of nothing. A pause. "No, I didn't." He had no argument for that. He stood in her doorway in his dress shirt, jacket gone for once, sleeves pushed back, and said the only true thing he could find. "I don't know how to do this." Something moved through her expression, not softness. Something more complicated than that, the flicker of a woman who had wanted to hear those words for long enough that hearing them now produced pain before anything else. "I know," she said quietly, and closed the door. He didn't knock again that night. But he didn't sleep either. He sat in his study with the security feed dark. He hadn't opened it in 4 days. Some line he'd drawn for himself that he couldn't articulate and turned the conversation over in his hands like a problem he didn't have the right framework to solve. "I don't know how to do this." He had said it as honesty. He wondered if she'd heard it as excuse. He thought about the second cup of tea, the mirror in the hallway, the laugh he'd overheard, bright and unguarded, belonging to a version of her that existed when he wasn't in the room. He thought about the message she'd read at 2:14 a.m. and chosen not to answer. 11 seconds. She had seen it immediately. She had been awake, and she had held that reply in her hands and decided he didn't get one yet. Yet. He caught himself on that word, turned it over, decided it was the only thing in the last 2 weeks that felt like possibility. She came to him 3 days later. He didn't expect it, had half prepared himself for the long architecture of earning back what he'd carelessly unmade, for weeks of careful proximity and unreturned gestures. But Tamara Uba had never done anything on his timeline, and she didn't start now. He was at his desk at mid-morning when she appeared in the study doorway, still in her day clothes, arms not crossed this time, hands loose at her sides, which he'd learned by now meant she had decided something and was standing inside that decision. "You want to say something?" he said, not a question. "I've been saying things for 2 years." Her voice was even. "You just weren't listening." He didn't argue. He pushed back from the desk slightly and waited, giving her the room. She walked in, didn't sit, stood in front of his desk and looked at him directly, those dark eyes steady and clear in a way that made him feel, absurdly, like he was the one being assessed. "You don't get to do this," she said. "You don't get to spend 2 years making me feel like a transaction you'd rather forget. And then knock on my door at 11 o'clock because something shifted in you that I'm not responsible for." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I have been invisible in this marriage. Not neglected, invisible, like I was furniture you inherited and didn't know what to do with." In-suk said nothing. There was nothing to say that wasn't just noise in the face of something that precise. "I stopped crying about it," she continued, quieter now. "That's what you should understand. I stopped. And that's not healing, In-suk, that's surrender. That's a woman who has decided that wanting things in this marriage is just a way to hurt herself." She stopped, held his gaze. "I will not keep doing that." The room was very quiet. Outside, Seoul moved through its midday pace, indifferent, 20 floors down. "I know," he said. "That's not enough." "No," he stood. Not to close distance just because sitting felt wrong for this. Felt like the wrong posture for the only honest conversation he'd had in years. "It isn't." She watched him come around the desk and stop, keeping space between them, enough space that she could breathe, could leave, could decide. "You asked me once," she said slowly, "in the first month. You asked me if I needed anything, and I said no because your voice told me the answer had already been decided." She exhaled. "I needed you to mean the question." He had no memory of it. That was the worst part. He had no memory of it because he had asked from obligation, had performed the question the way he performed everything in their domestic life, correctly and at distance. He said, "I know what I've done." "Do you?" "I do." And then because it was the only thing left, because he had run out of control and composure and careful management and was standing in his own study feeling more exposed than he had in the back of a car with a gun at his temple at 26, he told her the truth. "I stayed away from you because I couldn't afford not to." The words came out even, measured, but there was something underneath them that wasn't either of those things. "In my world, what I want becomes a liability the moment anyone else knows I want it. And you—" He stopped, started again. "From the beginning, you were— I couldn't look at you directly. I didn't let myself. Because looking meant wanting, and wanting meant weakness. And weakness in my world means someone you care about ends up used against you." Tamara was very still. "So I built a wall," he said, "and I told myself it was protection." "For who?" she asked softly. The question landed exactly where it was aimed. "I thought for both of us," he said. "I understand now it was only ever for me." She didn't collapse into him. He hadn't expected her to, had known, on some level, that the woman who had survived 2 years of invisible marriage without shattering completely was not going to come apart at a single confession, no matter how long overdue. She stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "I almost left last week." His chest tightened. "I know. Not for someone else." She looked at him steadily. "Just gone. Done. I had thought through the whole thing. What I'd take. What I'd say. A beat. What I wouldn't say." "What stopped you?" She was quiet for a long moment. 11 seconds, she said finally. He didn't understand immediately, and then he did the message, 2:14 a.m., read immediately, unanswered. She had been awake because she'd been planning to leave. And he had sent 3 words into the dark, and she had held them and made a different decision. Something shifted in his chest that he thought might be the last of the wall coming down. She turned toward the door. He moved, not thinking, not calculating, just moving, and she heard him and stopped, and he was standing at her shoulder without quite touching her, close enough that she stilled. "If you leave," he said, and his voice was low, stripped of everything professional and performative, just the raw material of the man underneath all of it. "You won't just be walking away from this marriage. You'll be walking away from the only man who has been fighting himself not to reach for you every single day for 2 years. She didn't turn around immediately. He waited. He was good at waiting, had built a career on it, but he had never waited for anything that mattered the way this did. When she turned, her eyes were bright, but her chin was steady, and she looked at him like she was deciding something final. "That's not enough," she said for the second time. "I know. Then what are you offering me?" And Insuk Kwan, who had negotiated empires, who had sat across tables from men who would kill without hesitation and spoken without a tremor, took a slow breath and said, "Whatever you ask for, on your terms. Not mine." She asked for time. He gave it to her without condition, which she hadn't expected, had braced for bargaining, for the subtle reframing that powerful men use to make concessions feel like generosity. There was none of that. He simply said all right and stepped back and let her have the room. What followed was not a montage of grand gestures. Tamara had no use for grand gestures from a man who had once made her feel like a ghost in her own home. What she asked for was smaller and harder than that. Presence without agenda, conversation without performance. The ordinary intimacy of being acknowledged, of having someone register that she existed, had preferences, took up space that mattered. He showed up for it imperfectly. He arrived at dinner one evening and sat across from her and asked about her day in the cautious, slightly stiff way of a man who was learning a language from scratch in his 40s. She answered briefly. He asked a follow-up. She looked at him slightly sideways, recalibrating, and answered more fully. They sat at that long table and talked for 40 minutes about something that had nothing to do with business, or their arrangement, or the careful architecture of what they were to each other. It was unremarkable. It was the most important dinner of his adult life. He started small because she had told him, in her quiet, exact way, that she didn't trust Large. Large was easy. Large was a man trying to overwrite history with spectacle. She wanted the small things done consistently, done without expectation of credit, done because he had decided she was worth showing up for even when there was nothing dramatic at stake. He learned her tea. Made it correctly, not had it ordered, made it himself, standing in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, figuring out the steeping time from the label, like a man performing an act of very private devotion. She came down one morning to find the cup waiting, made right, and stood in the kitchen looking at it for a moment. She looked at him. He looked back. "Sit down," she said finally. Not a command, an invitation. The difference was everything. He sat. She sat across from him. They drank their morning drinks in a silence that was entirely different from the silence of 2 years, not cold, not careful, not the loaded quiet of 2 people performing indifference. Just the easy, breathing stillness of 2 people who had decided to be in the same room on purpose. Outside, Seoul was loud and indifferent as always. In here, something was being built. Slowly, with imperfect materials, by 2 people who hadn't done it before and were doing it anyway. Tamara set her terms 3 weeks later. She did it over the same kitchen table, with her tea and his coffee, in the mid-morning quiet. She had written nothing down she didn't need to. She laid them out one by one in her clear, precise voice, and he listened without interrupting, which she noted. She would not be invisible again. If he withdrew, if the distance returned, if she became furniture, she would leave without a second conversation. She was not a lesson he got to learn twice. She would not be managed. If he had fears, she expected to hear them before they became walls between them. She was not asking him to be unguarded with the world, only with her. She would be known, not as his wife in the peripheral, transactional sense, but actually known. Her history, her family, her interior life. The parts of herself she had stopped offering because offering them into silence had hurt too much. Insuk listened to all of it. Then he said, yes. Not I'll try, not I'll do my best. Just, yes, clean and complete. She studied him. This isn't a negotiation I'm giving you room to win, Insuk. This is a condition I'm setting because I have already decided what I'll do if it's broken. I know, he held her gaze. The answer is still yes. She was quiet a moment. Then she reached across the table a small gesture, unhurried, entirely hers, and set her hand over his. He looked down at it. He turned his hand over slowly and held it. They sat like that while the city ran its 20 floors below business, and the morning light moved across the kitchen floor. And Insuk Kwan, who had never in his life let anything be this uncomplicated, let it be exactly that. Not a transaction. Not a strategy. Just a man finally holding on. That's the end of their beginning. Follow for what happens when a dangerous man has to keep a promise, because Insuk is about to find out that earning her is a different kind of war entirely.